Greetings, Torah scholars, and happy Hanukkah. Welcome back to Advanced Judaism for Beginners on the topic of Mitzvot Yeshuv, the mitzvah of settling the land, part 2. As you noticed in the last few videos, the general style that I will conduct these videos is that we'll discuss specific topics in Judaism, and we'll learn it le'iyun, in-depth analysis. And while we're learning it, we'll explore various ideas in Judaism. We'll increase with God's help, we'll increase our knowledge in Judaism. And the purpose of that is that in learning Torah and increasing our knowledge in Judaism should inspire us to do good in the world and to do more Torah and Mitzvot. So that's the general idea. I just want to share with you a short story on that, on the journey of learning. So they say a story, I believe it's about the Rabbi Maharash, who's the fourth Chabad Rabbi, a Chabad leader. I believe the story it says about him is that once he had a specific question in learning Torah in a specific topic. And he had a question, and he was searching for the answer. And he was opening a bunch of books, and he had piles of books, of open books, and just like browsing around his library. Of course, this is before the age of AI, before the age of internet. This story about 100 years ago, even earlier. So he's searching, and a whole day he's browsing his books. And after a very intense search, someone at the house asked him, "No, did you find the answer?" So he said no, but he said something interesting. He says that regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, it says that he was a very wealthy man, and it says the words of the sages is Loi nisasher Moshe ela meshivre aluchos, that Moshe Rabbeinu became so wealthy from the fragments of the tablets of the 10 Commandments. Now, what does it mean? That the material that was made, out of that was made the tablets, so that was made from a stone, a precious stone, a sapphire stone from heaven. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu himself carved out the tablets to have the 10 Commandments in them. And the fragments out of those carving outs, Moshe kept it to himself. And from that, he became very wealthy, from those fragments. So the sages are teaching us that Moshe Rabbeinu, who was known to be so wealthy, became wealthy from those fragments of the 10 Commandments. So the Rebbe Maharash said, I did not find the actual answer to my question. But in my journey of searching for that answer, I found a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and that made me very rich, mentally speaking, spiritually speaking. So that was the story. Sometimes the journey can enrich us so much, even without getting the bottom line answer. But here, of course, we will Be'ezus Hashem, also get to the bottom line answer. So now, on our topic, and again, the topic is Mitzvot Yeshuv, the mitzvah of settling the land of Israel, the Holy Land. So before we're further discussing that topic, there's a important topic in Judaism that I want to discuss for the next few minutes. That is the topic of how many of the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments. Now, let's take a step back, like this. The source of all our commandments, our mitzvot, is obviously from the 5 books of Moses, from Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Now, if you open in the 5 books of Moses, of course you're going to see there many instructions that God gives the Jews through Moses. Instructions such as wage a war against that nation. Instructions such as the Exodus, leave Egypt middle of the night. Instructions such as keep the Shabbat, build a tabernacle, eat this, don't eat that. If you open it, there are many, many instructions. Some passages have more instructions. Some is more of a narrative of the story of the Jewish people, but it's full of instructions. Now, nowhere in the 5 books of Moses does God say, I gave you 613 commandments. Nowhere there does God enumerates the amounts, the number of commandments. He doesn't take count. Who does? So where did we get the number 613 mitzvot? By the way, again, that number 613, I'm assuming you'll be familiar with. Generally, the sages split it to 248 positive commandments. Mitzvot aseh. A mitzvah means positive commandment, means that you need to do to keep the Shabbat, to rest on Shabbat, I should say. To eat matzah, for example, on Passover. And then the split is there's 365, the prohibition, the negative commandments, don't do. For example, don't desecrate the Shabbat. And don't eat chametz in Pesach. Don't murder. Don't steal. Now, some of you might be familiar with this in the prayer that we make for the sick people in the synagogue during the weekday in the Torah. So the wording there we ask is that they should be healed in their 248 body parts. The sages are telling us that number is corresponding to the positive mitzvot, 248 Eivarim, body parts. And then we have the 365 Gidim, the tendons, corresponding to the negative mitzvot. So it's very interesting. So the sages teach us that the amount of mitzvot is corresponding to the human anatomy. Interesting. So now, again, nowhere in the 5 books of Moses does God say, I gave you 613 commandments. The first time it mentions this number, that we're giving a number to the amount of commandments that we have, is actually in the Talmud, in the tractate Makot. And by the way, the Talmud again is compiled in the 5th century. So, and of course the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was given to us about 3,300 years ago. But it means for 1,500 years, seemingly we don't have that number until we have it in the Talmud. Now again, the Talmud does bring earlier opinions, so that opinion comes earlier, but it was actually documented for the first time in the Talmud. So the Talmud gives us the number 613 mitzvot. So that's where we get that number. Now, the Talmud, the opinion that rabbi that brings there the 613 mitzvot, he doesn't mention what are the 613 mitzvot. He does not enumerate them. He just says plainly there are 613 mitzvot. So this started a new skill amongst Torah scholars. How do we count the 613 mitzvot? How do we look at the 5 books of Moses? Which of the instructions that God gave us is part of the 613 mitzvot, and which ones are not? And you might think it's simple, but it's quite an art. And these Torah scholars that started this, they were called Monei HaMitzvot, those who count, enumerate the mitzvot. It started the first one of the first one was Rabbi Saadia Gaon. He lived, I should have looked that up, but he lived in the time of the Gaonim. So we're probably talking like in the 9th century. Rabbi Saadia Gaon, who lived in the era of the Gaonim, that's the rabbinic era, the Jewish era, from the 7th century through the 10th century or so. And that was still the time where the main center of Jewish life, of Jewish learning, was still in the Middle East. At that time was in Iraq, in Babylon. Later, the Muslim kingdom rose and various wars came with the center of Jewish life shifted to Europe. That was after the Gaonim time. Already during the time of the Gaonim themselves, there were Jews throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Europe, but the main centers still of Jewish life was still in Babylon. So one of the rabbinic rabbis of that generation was Rabbi Saadia Gaon. And he's one of the first ones to actually count the mitzvot. Another famous monea mitzvot from the mitzvot counters is the Rambam, Maimonides. He came from the next era, from the Rishonim. Again, at that time, the center of Jewish life shifted to Europe, and he actually started his life in Spain, but later moved on to Egypt, but he started in Spain. And he also counted the mitzvot. Now, what is unique about Maimonides is that he's one of the only ones of Monea Mitzvot, those that counted the mitzvot, that he actually shares with us his system, his systematic way of counting the mitzvot. And like I said, it's not always straightforward. It's something that you need to learn. There's a certain art and science to it. No, so Maimonides shared his methodology, his system of how he counts the mitzvot in his Sefer HaMitzvot, in the book of the mitzvot, where there he counts the mitzvot, he enumerates them. In the introduction, he brings what he calls the 14th Shoshei HaMitzvot. The Shoresh literally means the root, but means over here the 14 principles of what makes a mitzvah, and what not. Meaning, what will we count as a mitzvah and what is not. So, for example, from his 14th principle, and again, Maimonides again is a giant of a figure, and what's very unique about him is that he's very, very systematic about his teachings across the board. When he speaks about philosophy, when he speaks about things that are more esoteric, and also when he speaks about how does he count the mitzvot, and also in the medical world. He was actually a doctor. Though I do want to mention that a doctor in the medieval time was very different than a doctor today. Just by the way, but different point. Then essentially a doctor was more kind of what we would know as a life coach, and not like a health coach, kind of a nutritionist or something like that. And obviously the medical knowledge was not the way we have it today, obviously. But he was a doctor at the time. And in fact, actually, Maimonides was the personal doctor of the viceroy of Egypt in his time. Again, this is about the 12th century. So Maimonides, being a very methodical, a very systematic rabbi and teacher, so in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, he writes 14 principles of what makes a mitzvah. So I'm just going to share with you a few examples that he brings. He says that many times the Torah, God, will instruct us various details of the mitzvah, but I'm only going to count it as one mitzvah. So for example, during Sukkot, we take the 4 species, right? The etrog, the palm branch, the myrtle, and yet it's all going to be considered one mitzvah. And indeed, we make a single blessing on it because it is one mitzvah. So even though when you're going to open the Torah, it will tell you, take the etrog. Actually, it would say, take a beautiful fruit, and take a myrtle branch, and take a branch of palm. So you would think to enumerate 4. Maimonides tells you, no, these are details within that one mitzvah. A simple principle he shares. Another simple principle he shares, one of the 14, is we will not count mitzvot that are rabbinic, only ones that are biblical. So for example, we light in Hanukkah the menorah, and indeed we make a blessing on lighting the menorah. And the blessing, actually, the wording there is that God instructed us to light the menorah, yet nowhere in the five books of Moses do you see about lighting the menorah that we do today in Hanukkah. So we don't count it as one of the 613. By the way, the reason why we still make a blessing that God instructed us to do, to make a blessing, is because God gave the authority to the rabbis to make enactments. So based on that divine authority, we say that God instructed us to light the menorah on Hanukkah. But it's not one of the 613 mitzvot. So there, again, Maimonides gives you, and again, I believe is the only one, I believe, that actually shares with you his system of how he counts the mitzvot. Another just example is that, the Rambam is telling us that some mitzvot needs bunch of preparations. And those preparations that are listed in the Torah will not be counted as a separate mitzvah. And Maimonides, Rambam, brings an example of the showbread, lechem apanim, that was placed in the temple. So there, if you look at the Torah, the way God is giving us the instructions, again, through Moses, he's telling us, take the flour and then they bake it, and then you shall do this, do that. It gives you a bunch of instructions. You shall do this with the flour, you should do that. And then finally it tells us, and you shall place it in the temple as a showbread, lechem apanim. There the Rambam is telling us, obviously we're not going to count it all as separate mitzvot, to separate the flour, to bake the flour, even though it's listed in the Torah. But this is clearly preparation to the mitzvah itself. So again, this is how the Rambam is giving us the 613 mitzvot. Now, another note, obviously, you can have, not obviously, but you can have something that is biblically commanded, but it's not part of the 613 mitzvot per se. For example, according to most sages, most halachic opinions, to say the prayer of Shema every day is biblically commanded. However, nowhere in the Torah will you see, you shall say the Shema every day. It actually brings the verses of the Shema, the text of the Shema, you will find it in the Torah, of course. But you will not find in the Torah somewhere that will say, and you shall say it every day. Yet, according to many sages, this is biblically commanded, even though it's not part of the 613 mitzvot. And why? Because according to them, it's not saying the Shema prayer, it's not 613 mitzvot, but it's an extension of other 613 mitzvot. So according to some opinion, for example, in this example, to say the Shema, it's part of the mitzvah of Yetzias Mitzrayim that we need to remember. We must remember, and this is one of the Taryag mitzvot, one of the 613 mitzvot, we must remember the exodus out of Egypt, that we were once upon slave and we were freed. We need to remember that. Again, one of the 613 mitzvot. So one opinion holds that saying the Shema is an extension of that mitzvah. So what that means is that it's saying the Shema, it's biblically commanded, but that for itself is not one of the 613 mitzvot. So again, just to summarize this idea is the Talmud is giving us the number 613 mitzvot. Then in later periods in Jewish history, various rabbis came and had their own list of what are the 613 mitzvot. And there's some disagreements between them, what is counted and what is not. And we'll see that soon. So that is kind of the art and science of the 613 mitzvot. And again, what makes Maimonides unique, that he shares with you in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, the Shorshei HaMitzvot, his methodology of how he counted, his systematic counting of the mitzvot. So thank you for bearing with me on this topic. Now, bringing this to our discussion of the Mitzvot Yeshuv Haaretz, the law, the mitzvah of settling the land. In the Maimonides count, nowhere is there a mitzvah of settling the land. It's not listed there. Now, yes, there are many mitzvot that are associated with the land of Israel, such as to build a temple, many agricultural mitzvot, such as the sabbatical year. So there are many mitzvot being listed in the Rambam that are associated with the land of Israel. But the mitzvah per se of just settling the land, building a civilization, a civilized land, a society, a country, whatever you want to call it, to build cities, to build a home, that for itself is not being listed as a mitzvah of the 613 mitzvot of Maimonides. Then comes Nachmanides, that we discussed last week. Nachmanides, at the end of the Rambam in his book of Sefer HaMitzvot, he took out 20 mitzvot of Maimonides and inserted 20 mitzvot of him. In other words, he agrees with most of the counting of Maimonides, but he says that Maimonides missed some. He made a mistake. He made mistakes. He disagrees with him, and he said that some, for some reason, he skipped, and others he shouldn't have listed. Again, because they all have to pack in the 613 mitzvot. So Nachmanides take out 20 and brings in 20. The fourth one that Nachmanides brings in is the mitzvah of settling the land. Nachmanides does have listed as the fourth one that it's a mitzvah of settling the land. I'm just going to read the first few lines. שנצטוו לרשת הארץ אשר לא סנקל, יישא ללבסון לאברהם, ליצחק וליעקב, ולא נעזבו ביד זולתנו, ונאום אותו לשוממו, והוא אמרו להם, והורישתם את הארץ. I'll read it in English. Oh, I do not have it in English in front of me. I apologize. So I'm going to translate this to the best of my ability. Just a sec. That we were commanded, שנצטווינו, to inherit the land that Hashem gave to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we should not leave it to other nations, that land, and we should not leave it empty. So we have a positive commandment to settle the land, to make sure that it's occupied. So that is, Nachmanides actually brings it as a mitzvah. Now, with Nachmanides, if you recall from last week, this is consistent with the way he understood the verses that I mentioned last week. And again, just summarizing from last week we had vehorishtem, the wording to inherit. So we said there's two understandings. Rashi understands it, that it's together with the previous mitzvah of expelling the 7 ancient nations. And Nachmanides, that was Rashi's understanding. Nachmanides translates the second Ve'orishtem as that you need to settle it. That's how he learns those words. And based on this, he actually enumerates it as a mitzvah in the 613 mitzvot. So let's make a summary of what we learned today. So just to make sure we're holding our head. So we started to discuss the 613 mitzvot, that number that is being brought in the Talmud. And as we see, this is this kind of a skill of how to count the mitzvot was developed by various monea mitzvot, the rabbis who counted the mitzvot. Sometimes they disagree of what is included in those numbers. And many of them they agreed, of course. And we brought Maimonides that he shares with us his system, his 14 principles of what he'll count as a mitzvah and what's not. And indeed, we see that when it comes to settling the land, is it listed as a mitzvah per se? Maimonides does not list it. Nachmanides does list it in his 613 mitzvot. That is summary of today. One last point I would add just in a minute. As I also mentioned last week, that one of the Rishonim, Rabbi Rambam ibn Israel, that again, he used to love to argue with the sages when it came to the understanding, but not in terms of halakha. So he actually disagrees with the whole count of 613 mitzvot. He says it's one opinion of the Talmud, and no way could you count the mitzvot. He says it's an impossible task, and he actually brings verses that says that really the Torah goes to infinity, and you cannot really count it. Again, that's of Avram ibn Ezra. It's kind of a minority opinion. Again, he used to love to argue with the sages, but according to most sages, of course, that number 613 mitzvot is valid, and our job is to learn which one is one of the 613 mitzvot. Thank you. Thank you for joining. All the best.